20-year-old Alta Apentenko was having a difficult time in 1971. She was raising her 21-month-old daughter, Melissa Highsmith, on her own after separating from Melissa's father. She was working as a waitress in Fort Worth, Texas, to support Melissa, but had trouble finding adequate childcare. She placed an ad for a babysitter in a local newspaper. She received a response from a woman who said she could watch Melissa at her home. Alta did not get a chance to meet with this woman before hiring her, because she desperately needed care for Melissa so she could work her shifts and keep her job. On August 23, 1971, she left Melissa with her roommate when she went to work, having made arrangements for the babysitter to pick Melissa up. The babysitter arrived as planned, and the roommate gave her Melissa. According to the roommate, the woman was well-dressed and wore white gloves. The babysitter did not bring Melissa back to the apartment at the scheduled time. She did not return at all, and Alta called the police. The search for Melissa would drag on for decades, eventually becoming one of Fort Worth's oldest missing persons cases. Alta would endure not only heartbreak over her daughter vanishing, but also suspicion that she had done something to her daughter and created the story about the babysitter to cover up what she had done. She eventually reconciled with Melissa's father, Jeffrey Highsmith, after they worked together to search for their daughter, and had 4 more children. Alta and Jeffrey never gave up hope that they would find Melissa, dropping everything to travel across the country to chase down potential leads as they came up. Over the years, they identified several women who they believed could have been Melissa, only to be disappointed to learn that they were not once DNA tests were conducted. The Highsmith family regularly held vigils for Melissa on her birthday, November 6th. They held one for her on November 6th, 2022, her 53rd birthday. Later that same day, they received the clue that would help them finally find Melissa after more than 51 years, when Melissa's father Jeffrey received a notification from the commercial DNA website 23andMe. The notification showed that Jeffrey had matched with someone who had also submitted their DNA to the site. Based on the amount of DNA Jeffrey shared with this person, she appeared to be his granddaughter, but it was no one he actually knew. The family then turned to an amateur genealogist, who used Ancestry.com and public records to locate and contact the previously unknown granddaughter's adoptive father. He remembered the name of his daughter's biological father and the first name of her biological mother. This led the genealogist to a marriage certificate and the full name of the woman's biological mother. The Highsmiths found her on Facebook and sent her a message telling her they believed they were her family. The woman they contacted was 53-year-old Melanie Walden. Upon reading the Facebook message, Melanie initially did not believe that she could be Melissa and thought that the message could be part of a scam. However, when she was told about a birthmark Melissa had on her back, she became open to the idea, as she had a birthmark in the same spot. Melanie confronted the woman she believed to be her mother, who then admitted that she had purchased Melanie for $500 back in 1972, and that at some point she had realized that Melanie was the baby Melissa whose kidnapping had been featured in the local media. DNA testing later confirmed that Melanie was Melissa Highsmith, and she was reunited with her family at the end of November 2022. Melissa's life as Melanie had been difficult. She believed the woman who raised her was her biological mother, but that she had regretted having her. She had an abusive childhood that led to her running away from home as a teenager. She endured multiple failed marriages and was arrested on several occasions. By the time she was 19, she had given birth to 3 children, all of whom were taken from her custody and put up for adoption. By the time her family located her, Melanie's life had dramatically improved. She became very religious, which in turn led to her making money by cleaning her church. She expanded on that work by beginning to clean houses as well. In April of 2022, she got married again to a man named John Brown, who she considers to be her soulmate. Given her difficult upbringing and poor relationship with the people she knew as her mother and stepfather, learning that she had loving parents and siblings who had spent decades searching for her was very emotional for her. While the statute of limitations for the kidnapping has long since passed, police in Fort Worth are still investigating the case. Melanie looks forward to spending more time with her family, especially her mother, with whom she shared an immediate connection. She plans on using her birth name of Melissa and wants to have a new marriage ceremony with her husband so that her father can walk her down the aisle. Lillian Decloe spent much of her life helping others, working as a teacher and a nurse, and caring for most of the members of her family at one time or another. By 1994, when she was 89, however, she herself required help. She was beginning to experience problems with her health, including memory loss. Her niece, June, would come to see Lillian to help care for her at her home in Pompano Beach, Florida. June arrived for one such visit on April 29, 1994, but it was not a typical visit. When she went into Lillian's home and called out for her aunt, she received no response. Thinking her aunt was taking a nap, June looked into the bedroom where she would normally nap during the day, but she was not there. Instead, she then discovered Lillian's body on the floor at the end of a hallway. Lillian had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. Other injuries indicated that she had fiercely fought against her killer. She had numerous contusions all over her body, and her ribs, wrist, and nose had been fractured. The house had been ransacked, leading authorities to believe the murder had been committed during the course of a burglary. The killer appeared to have entered the home through a window. There were no witnesses or evidence that pointed to a potential suspect at the time, and years went on without an arrest. Finding her aunt's body was a traumatic experience for June, and she would be haunted by the image of Lillian's lifeless body on the floor for years. She had to take a full year off of work and get help caring for her children while she learned to cope with what she had seen. The case was eventually transferred to the Broward County Sheriff's Office, and their cold case homicide unit reopened the case in 2019. They re-examined the evidence from the case and found that the killer had left semen on Lillian's nightgown. The BSO's crime lab developed a DNA profile from the semen, but did not identify a match. Investigators then partnered with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement to conduct a familial search of their database. This identified a close relative of the killer, later identified as his son, who had spent time in prison. By investigating his family, authorities found a potential suspect. Unfortunately, the potential suspect had died in 2010 at the age of 56. In August of 2019, his remains were exhumed, and a sample of his bone marrow was extracted from them. It would not be until December 13, 2022, however, that this individual's DNA was confirmed to be a match to the DNA from the crime scene. That day, the Broward County Sheriff's Office announced the identification of Johnny Mack Brown as Lillian's murderer. Brown was a former Marine and a veteran of the Vietnam War. He suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder and had substance abuse issues. He was periodically homeless throughout his adult life, but was living just a few houses down from Lillian at the time of her murder. The sheriff's office believes he may have broken into her house with the intention just to rob it to support his drug habit. Even though Brown cannot be prosecuted for his crimes, Lillian's family believes she can rest in peace now that authorities consider her case solved. On the evening of January 24th, 1980, around 6:50 p.m., the Barton County Sheriff's Office was called to a home in the Nelson Trailer Park just west of Great Bend, Kansas. When they arrived, they were met with a bloody scene and the body of a young woman who had been shot multiple times. The young woman was 23-year-old Mary Robin Walter. Her body had been discovered by her husband, with whom she had a 5-year-old daughter, Pamela. At the time of her murder, Robin was a nursing student at Barton County Community College. Multiple law enforcement agencies, including the Kansas Bureau of Investigation and the Great Bend Police Department, worked on the case alongside the sheriff's office. Despite numerous interviews and the identification of a person of interest, they were not able to identify enough evidence to file charges against anyone for Robin's murder. In April of 2022, Detective Sergeant Adam Hales of the Barton County Sheriff's Office began looking at Robin's case while he was recovering from COVID. Looking at the files, he realized that some information had been overlooked and some information had been added to the file later on, but not brought to the attention of the initial investigators. 2 more detectives were assigned to investigate the case further with him. In October of 2022, their investigation uncovered new information in the case, which led to them submitting Robin's case to Barton County Attorney Levi Morris for review. He reviewed the case over the following month and obtained an arrest warrant for murder in the 2nd degree in connection to Robin's murder. On December 8, 2022, 68-year-old Stephen Hanks was arrested in Oxford, Kansas, and taken to the Barton County Jail. He is currently being held in lieu of a $500,000 bond. Hanks had been one of Robin's neighbors at the time of her murder, and had been the early person of interest in the case. He had been arrested in 1981 for rape, battery, robbery, and burglary, and was incarcerated from 1983 until 1993. Authorities are not disclosing what the new evidence that finally led to his arrest is, out of concern for jeopardizing the ongoing criminal proceedings. They believe that because the case was solved after 42 years and 10 months, it is the oldest homicide arrest in the history of the state of Kansas, and one of the oldest cases to be solved with an arrest, rather than just a posthumous identification, in the United States. Hanks being charged with the murder did not come as a shock to Robin's family, who had long believed he was her killer. Robin's daughter Pamela says she had already chosen to forgive Hanks years before he was charged with her mother's murder. After years of nightmares about the death of her mother, Pamela has mentally blocked out a lot of the details of her mother's murder, choosing to focus instead on the happy memories she has of Robin, like her mother teaching her how to brush her teeth. Pamela continues to wear her mother's wedding ring. Robin's niece, Leslie Schrag, issued a statement on behalf of the family following the arrest of Hanks. It read in part, "We are grateful for detectives' efforts to bring Robin's murderer to justice. Robin was truly beautiful, inside and out. This world was robbed of her presence, and we will never know how that has shaped our lives. Friday's news is bittersweet. Many of those who knew Robin are gone. Her parents, husband, and a sister will not get to share in our collective relief that Robin's case will have a conclusion." "20-year-old Claire Gravel was a native of North Andover, Massachusetts. According to her friends, she was kind and smart, and had a sweet smile. In 1986, Claire was a sophomore at Salem State College. On June 29, 1986, she played in a softball game, and then went out with her team to Major McGleish's pub on Washington Street in Salem. Claire left the pub around 1 a.m. on June 30th, although what happened to her after that is unclear. A friend claimed to have given her a ride back to the rooming house on Loring Street where she was living, but there were no sightings of her there, and police were never able to independently verify this claim. Another witness said they saw Claire outside the pub, arguing with a man before getting into his car. 3 workers discovered Claire's body on the afternoon of June 30th in the woods off of Route 128 in Beverly. She had been strangled to death. The case went cold within days, with one investigator already telling the media they were at a stalemate in the investigation as early as July 5th. Inaccurate rumors of a white truck being connected to the crime, and of Claire having been severely beaten, led to numerous tips that did not further the investigation being called in. It would be more than 36 years before charges were brought against a suspect in Claire's case. On August 24, 2022, Essex District Attorney Jonathan Blodgett announced that a grand jury had just indicted 63-year-old John Carey for Claire's murder. He was arraigned on October 21st, appearing in court via video conference, and pled not guilty. Carey was already incarcerated in Massachusetts, serving a 20-year sentence due to be completed in 2027. This sentence stemmed from a conviction for attempted murder and home invasion. he attempted to strangle the wife of one of his friends to death in her home, and was only stopped when the victim's 12-year-old son came upon the attack and helped his mother fight Carrie off. Carrie was tied to Claire's case thanks to DNA. He had been compelled to provide a sample of his DNA when he was incarcerated, so his DNA profile was in the database when investigators later ran a DNA profile they found on Claire's tank top through the system. The tank top had been made into a figure 8 and used to strangle Claire. Claire's father, brothers, and sister-in-law were in court for Carrie's arraignment. After the court proceedings were complete, Bob Gravel told the media that Claire was always on his mind, and he was heading to the cemetery to tell her what had transpired in court that day. "43-year-old Richard Bischel Sr. was a former Marine who had served during the Korean War. In 1977, he was living in Alameda, California, and working as a mechanic. He had a wife and 3 sons. He was a kind man who would do whatever he could to help people, whether they were friends or strangers to him. In the early morning hours of March 16, 1977, there was a break-in and attempted burglary at the Bischel home. Richard and his 17-year-old son, Richard Jr., chased the intruder out of the house and onto the street. The younger Richard fell behind as they ran, and when he reached his father, he was on the ground, and the burglar was gone. Richard Sr. had been stabbed 10 times. He was taken to the hospital, where he died of his injuries. Richard's killer would not be identified for 45 years. On March 22, 2022, the Alameda Police Department held a press conference announcing that based on circumstantial as well as DNA evidence, they had identified Richard's killer as Richard Curly Bernard. Bernard was a career criminal with convictions for burglaries and 2 rapes in California in the 1970s. Unfortunately, he could not be prosecuted for the murder, as he had been shot and killed while committing another crime in Texas in 1989. The suspect is deceased, but the family of the victim now knows the identity of the perpetrator, and that law enforcement never stopped looking for him, Alameda County Deputy District Attorney Mark Melton said at the press conference. Bernard had been an early suspect in the case, but police did not have enough evidence at the time to charge him with Richard's murder. They were able, however, to confiscate a blood-stained jacket from Bernard's residence. DNA testing of the blood was not possible at the time, but it was in 2021, when the Alameda Police Department established a small cold case unit. They submitted the jacket to the Serological Forensic Laboratory in Richmond for forensic analysis, which ultimately revealed that the blood on the jacket belonged to Richard Bischel Sr. and led to Bernard being officially identified as his killer. Richard Bischel Jr. was present at the press conference identifying his father's killer. He had requested the case be reopened 23 years before it was finally solved. Addressing the media, he said in part, "I want to say thank you to the Alameda Police Department and the Cold Case Unit for their hard work. I didn't believe this was ever going to be real. I had always hoped, but I always thought the case would just lay there." "79-year-old Lucille Hultgren lived in the Galt, California area for 25 years, having previously lived in Ohio. She spent most of those years living with her husband Frank, but in May of 1986, she was living alone because Frank had passed away due to Alzheimer's disease 7 months earlier. She was the loving mother of 2 grown sons. She had a kind and sweet personality and loved taking care of others. Children in her neighborhood were always welcome in her house for cookies and lemonade during the summer. She had a strong religious faith and was active at her church. Her friends were therefore concerned when Lucille failed to attend church one Sunday. The following day, May 23, 1986, 2 of her friends went to her home to check on her. They were able to get inside through a sliding glass door, which they found partially opened. Inside the home, they found Lucille's body, which had visible, severe injuries. They immediately left and drove to the Galt Police Department to get help. Lucille's autopsy showed that she had been sexually assaulted and had died as a result of being stabbed in the chest and strangled. The coroner placed her time of death as between 2 and 5 days before her body was found. A large amount of evidence was collected from Lucille's home, and dozens of interviews were conducted. However, no arrest was made in the case. Almost 36 years later, in January of 2022, the Sacramento County Crime Lab re-examined the evidence preserved from Lucille's crime scene. DNA was found in scrapings taken from underneath Lucille's fingernails and from bodily fluids found on Lucille's bedding. When the profile sequence from that DNA was run through the criminal database, a match was found. On May 17, 2022, the Galt Police Department issued a press release identifying Lucille's killer as Terry Leroy Bramble, who had been 32 years old at the time of the murder. His DNA was in the database due to the fact that he was a registered sex offender because of a 1992 conviction for sexual assault in San Joaquin County. He was a longtime transient in the Galt area who lived under a Highway 99 bridge for many years. Unfortunately, he died of natural causes in 2011 and cannot be prosecuted for Lucille's murder. Lucille's oldest son, Frank, passed away before his mother's killer was identified, but her younger son, Henry, survived to see the identification. At 78 years old, he is almost the same age as his mother was at the time of her death. He described her as his champion, who he still misses every day. He was not sure he would ever see the case solved, and is grateful for the efforts of everyone who worked to solve the case. The Gutierrez family of Lexington County, South Carolina, spent the day of June 5, 1986, doing yard work. After the family ate a dinner of bacon, lettuce, and tomato sandwiches, Deborah Gutierrez painted her 4-year-old daughter Jessica's fingernails. Jessica, who went by the nickname Jessie, asked her mother if she could sleep in her bed that night. Deborah had to tell her no. Jessie had slept in her bed the night before, and Jessie's older brother was suffering from an ear infection, so Deborah wanted to let him sleep in her room instead so she could keep an eye on him. Jessie therefore slept in the double bed she shared with her older sister, 6-year-old Becky, that night. She went in to go to sleep around midnight on June 6th. When her mother woke up for the day a few hours later, she found her children's room in disarray. Their school papers were scattered across the floor, and the curtains had been pulled from one window. In addition, the front door was open. Deborah realized that Jessie was not in the room with Becky. When she asked Becky where her little sister was, Becky replied, "She's gone. The man with the magic hat and the beard took her last night." In a panic, Deborah tore through the room, looking for Jessie under the bed and in the covers. She tore through the house, looking in every closet and room before going outside to look for her daughter there. She was screaming Jessie's name the entire time. When she came back inside, she asked Becky why she hadn't screamed when the man in the magic hat took Jessie away. The little girl had no answer for her, but she would later say that she had been too afraid to do anything, including go back to sleep, once the man in the magic hat came in her room. The authorities were notified that the little girl was missing, and the search for her quickly began. Suspects were quickly identified, but could not be tied to Jessie's abduction. Jessie's mother had kicked her boyfriend out of the home just a few days before Jessie went missing because of his possessive behavior and abuse of alcohol. Deborah was sure he was involved in Jessie's disappearance, but no evidence supporting that theory could be found. Jessie's father was also investigated, but he was living in California at the time and was able to prove that he was still in that state when Jessie went missing. One major piece of evidence was collected at the crime scene. A fingerprint on the window authorities believed the kidnapper used to gain entry into the home. It was submitted to the FBI, but no match to the fingerprint was found in any database at the time. Jessie's mother, Deborah, was certain this fingerprint belonged to the man who took her daughter because she cleaned the home's storm door and the windows in her children's room every night with Windex, meaning any prints on those surfaces would have gotten there after she went to bed the night before. A new potential suspect emerged several weeks after Jessie vanished. An acquaintance of her family who was living in the area stole a van and drove it to North Carolina, where he raped a woman. He was subsequently charged with and convicted of this crime. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. At some point during this man's incarceration for this crime, his cellmate claims that he told him that he had abducted and killed a little girl in Lexington County, South Carolina, while wearing a cowboy hat. He allegedly said that he buried the little girl's body in a landfill. The cellmate reported these claims to the authorities, who followed up on the possibility that Jessie could have been the little girl the inmate had been discussing. They spent weeks searching a landfill near Jessie's home, but found nothing. The inmate was questioned and offered to talk in exchange for immunity, but authorities refused to make such a deal. Investigators evaluated the evidence they had against him, but ultimately determined they did not have enough evidence to prosecute this individual. A detective told Jessie's mother, Deborah, 2 weeks after the disappearance, that statistics showed that Jessie was almost certainly dead. While over the years, Deborah came to intellectually understand that her daughter was most likely no longer alive, she could never fully give up hope while there was still uncertainty over her fate. While she had to live with not knowing if Jessie was alive or dead, she did know that she would not give up on finding answers. "My baby's lost somewhere in the dark, and I'm not going to stop until I find her," she said in 2017. Jessie's case was reviewed in 2008 and in 2015, when it was transferred to the South Carolina Attorney General's office. In 2021, on the 35th anniversary of Jessie's abduction, a new age-progressed image of her was released to the public. In September of that year, a team from the FBI came to Lexington County to work on the case alongside the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division at the request of Lexington County Sheriff Jay Kuhn. The renewed effort paid off. Just before 8 a.m. on January 6, 2022, 61-year-old Thomas Eric McDowell was taken into custody at his home in Wake Forest, North Carolina. He is being charged with murder, kidnapping, and first-degree burglary in connection with Jessie's case. A district judge in North Carolina ruled he would be held without bond while awaiting extradition to South Carolina. Bond has so far been denied in South Carolina as well, now that he has been extradited, although he has so far only had one brief court appearance in that state. While McDowell is being charged with Jessie's murder, authorities have not located her body. Given the ongoing court proceedings against McDowell, authorities have formally only released a limited amount of information about the circumstances that led to his arrest. According to the arrest warrant, McDowell was being charged based on his fingerprint being a match to the one found on Jessie's window, a witness identifying him in a photo lineup, and his own admissions to the crime made to others. It is unclear, based on the information in the warrant, when the fingerprint was matched to McDowell, who made the identification, or when the identification occurred. Former Lexington County Sheriff James "Jimmy" Metz has confirmed to The State, a newspaper in Columbia, that McDowell is the previously publicly unidentified inmate alleged to have confessed to Jessie's murder. McDowell is a registered sex offender as a result of a March 1987 conviction for an offense which occurred in North Carolina. He also became an acquaintance of the Gutierrez family after his uncle married one of Deborah Gutierrez's cousins. McDowell had provided various alibis to investigators after his cellmate reported his confession, all of which were investigated and disproven. According to Jimmy Metz, he could never secure an arrest warrant for McDowell because prosecutors believed defense attorneys would be able to convince a jury that the fingerprint on the window had an alternative explanation. McDowell had previously done work at the property. Jessie's mother's claim that the window was cleaned daily does seem to be supported by the fact that McDowell's fingerprint appears to be the only fingerprint found on the window. The fingerprint was included as evidence supporting McDowell's arrest in the 2022 warrant. While Mr. Metz is overjoyed that McDowell has finally been arrested, he is also upset and embarrassed by the media coverage and statements from the current investigators that have not disclosed that McDowell had been identified as the prime suspect so soon after Jessie's disappearance. "It made us look like we hadn't done our job. We had investigated assiduously," he told The State. According to South Carolina Attorney General Alan Wilson, without this newly discovered information, our office would not be able to prosecute this case. it is currently unclear what new information allowed for authorities to finally arrest McDowell, and will most likely remain so until further progress is made in the court case against McDowell. Jesse's mother, Deborah, has described McDowell's arrest and the fact that he is being charged with her missing daughter's murder as bittersweet. "I'm glad God brought me to see it," she said after the arrest. "I prayed he would bring me through it, and we waited for this a long time." Deborah spoke at McDowell's first court appearance in South Carolina, asserting how important it was for him to remain in custody due to the threat he poses to the safety of the community. She and Jesse's sister Becky are also using the media attention the arrest has brought to Jesse's case to try to bring awareness to other cases and other families who have suffered as they have. While speaking in court and to the media afterwards, Deborah wore a face mask featuring a photo of Shelton Sanders, who disappeared in 2001. In addition to speaking about Jesse and her case, Deborah and Becky also spoke to the media about how important it is for cold cases, particularly those involving individuals of color, to receive attention from the media and effort from authorities. While McDowell's arrest is a major development in Jesse's case, her mother still has further answers to find, which will hopefully be revealed as the court case progresses. "I intend to find my daughter, and I hope to do just that," she said after McDowell's first court appearance. Diane Dahn was always a free spirit. She grew up in New Jersey, but spent a year away from her family as an exchange student in Austria. She was 4 years older than her sister Victoria, but the two were still very close. Because of her year abroad, Diane completed her final year of high school a year late, meaning that her and Victoria's high school careers overlapped for a year. While Diane would help Victoria learn things like music and foreign languages, during that year she also helped her skip school so that they could go skiing together. She was an accomplished musician who was skilled at playing the violin. Victoria moved to California, which separated her from Diane for several years, but Diane eventually followed, moving to California to be near her sister again. In 1988, 29-year-old Diane was living in an apartment complex on Graves Avenue in Santee, California, with her 2-year-old son, Mark. Mark and Victoria's daughter, Christine, had been born only a few months apart from one another, and Diane and Victoria spent as much time together as they could with their children. Diane worked for the San Diego Transit Corporation, where she had become their first female radio repair technician. Diane failed to report to work on Monday, May 2nd, 1988. One of Diane's co-workers therefore went over to her apartment to check on her. When they entered the apartment, they found Diane deceased in a back room. She had been stabbed in the chest, and it would later be determined that she had also been bludgeoned. She was nude, but an examination of her body did not find any signs that she had been sexually assaulted. Diane's young son was found wandering in a nearby area of the apartment complex, thankfully unharmed. The San Diego County Sheriff's Department did not find any signs of forced entry into Diane's apartment, nor did they find a motive for anyone to want to kill Diane. Diane's son Mark was adopted by a family friend and grew up with 2 older brothers. He remained close with his birth mother's family and regularly saw his aunt, cousins, and grandparents. Even with a loving adoptive family and a strong relationship with his biological family, Mark still sometimes felt alone as he grew up, knowing he had lost his mother. As years passed without a resolution to Diane's case, her family began losing hope. "I didn't think anything was ever going to come of this. I thought I, myself, was going to go to my grave, not knowing," Diane's sister Victoria would tearfully say years later. Investigators did not forget about Diane's case and tried to use new technology to solve it as it became available to them. Scrapings from under Diane's fingernails had been preserved, and in late 2000, they were tested in hopes of developing a DNA profile of Diane's killer. A profile was developed, but when it was uploaded to a national criminal database, no match was found. A hair follicle had also been found in Diane's hand, and a new technology was used to process it in the summer of 2010. However, when a DNA profile was developed, there was still no match to it in any database. Authorities then turned to genetic genealogy as a possible avenue for finally solving the case in May of 2020. The San Diego County Sheriff's Department utilized genealogy databases that give users the option of making their DNA profiles available for comparison to law enforcement. Close relatives of the killer were not in the database, which meant the process was very labor-intensive for investigators, as they created family trees of his more distant relatives, trying to identify him. Investigators contacted numerous individuals they believed to be distantly related to the killer, asking for information about their family histories, and ultimately constructed 9 family trees containing over 1,300 people related to the killer either by blood or marriage. The massive and detailed effort did eventually identify a potential suspect, but he had passed away since the murder. His children agreed to provide samples of their DNA. Testing on these samples confirmed that their father was the individual whose DNA was found under Diane's nails and in her hand. On March 16, 2022, authorities announced the identity of the suspect, Warren Robertson. Robertson, along with his wife and several other relatives, had lived in the same apartment complex as Diane in 1988. Authorities have not been able to determine if he and Diane knew each other prior to the murder. They both enjoyed racing and attended local stock car races at the nearby El Cajon Speedway. Robertson was never a suspect in the case prior to his DNA being matched to the DNA from the crime scene thanks to genetic genealogy. He was not mentioned in any reports from the initial investigation, and he does not appear to have been questioned in the initial canvassing of the apartment complex in 1988. Robertson was a native of Arkansas. He worked as a tow truck driver at the time of Diane's murder. He did have a criminal record, but only for low-level property crimes, not for any other violent offenses. Robertson and his family moved away from the apartment complex shortly after Diane was killed to Lakeside, California. They then moved again the following year, this time to Indiana. Robertson died in a house fire there in 1999, at the age of 39. At the press conference announcing Robertson's identification, Diane's sister recounted memories of her beloved sister and thanked members of law enforcement for never giving up on the case. She said that the day she learned a suspect had finally been identified was the best day of her life, aside from the days her children were born. Diane's now adult son Mark provided a video statement played at the press conference. While he was too young at the time of her death to have many strong memories of his mother, he stated that everyone who had ever spoken to him about his mother told him how good of a person she was. He likes to think he inherited those positive traits from her, and tries to be a good person, to be like his mother. The answers that my family received, it's closure, and closure is everything, even after so much time has passed, Mark said in the video. And now I have a story to tell the world, and tell people who cross my path. On November 17, 1978, an individual was out looking for firewood near Lake of the Woods in the Wyman National Forest in southern Oregon. While they were doing so, they came across a gruesome scene, approximately half a mile off of Dead Indian Road near Oregon Route 140. They discovered the badly decomposed body of a young man. Members of the Klamath County Sheriff's Office quickly responded to the scene. The following day, as they continued searching for clues as part of their investigation into the young man's death, they discovered the body of a young woman. Her body had also undergone extensive decomposition. The remains of a small dog were also found. The man and the woman had been haphazardly buried in separate shallow graves. Based on the callous way the bodies had been disposed of, authorities were able to immediately tell that whoever had placed the bodies there had absolutely no respect for the individuals. The male victim's wallet was found amongst his clothes, allowing authorities to quickly identify him as 19-year-old Kirk Leonard Wiseman. The female victim was soon identified as his girlfriend, 17-year-old Cynthia Lynn Frayer. Their autopsy showed that they had both been shot in the head multiple times with a .22 caliber firearm, and that Cynthia had been raped. The couple lived in Sepulveda, California, a neighborhood in Los Angeles that has since been renamed North Hills. They had been missing since September. The couple had been in Everett, Washington, visiting family, along with their brown and white terrier, who traveled with them in a carrier. They left Everett on September 23, 1978, to slowly make their way back to California, and took a flight from Seattle to Eugene, Oregon. Kirk and Cynthia were known to hitchhike regularly, and witnesses were found to support the theory that they had been hitchhiking around southern Oregon prior to their murders. After arriving in Eugene on the 23rd, they hitchhiked to Roseburg and spent the night in a motel there. A witness came forward reporting that they had then picked the couple up hitchhiking and dropped them off at a restaurant in Grants Pass. The couple had plans to visit Crater Lake at some point during their travels before they returned to California, because it was somewhere Cynthia had always wanted to visit. She had traveled in the area with her family the year before, but bad weather had forced them to cancel their plans to visit Crater Lake, and made Cynthia even more determined to see it. One of the few items that was discovered along with the victims' bodies was a sign that read K Falls. The couple may have used the sign while hitchhiking, looking for a ride to Klamath Falls. Investigators came to believe that the couple had been killed by someone who picked them up hitchhiking, either while they were traveling from Ashland to Klamath Falls, or while they were traveling back to Ashland after visiting Klamath Falls. They were never able to find evidence confirming that the couple had made it to Klamath Falls. Carl Burkhart was a detective with the Klamath County Sheriff's Office in 1978, and one of the first investigators to respond to the scene when Kirk's body was first discovered. He eventually went on to become the sheriff of Klamath County. He maintained his interest in the case until he retired in 2001. Several other investigators would work on the case for the next 2 decades, with the collective efforts of everyone who worked on the case ultimately leading to it being solved. The evidence from the case was carefully preserved in 1978, meaning that when technology to isolate and process DNA evidence became more commonly used by law enforcement decades later, the evidence was still available for forensic examination. Investigators began looking at the case and exploring the possibility of DNA evidence being found on some of the preserved items in 2011. However, it would not be until 2019 that the crime lab was able to identify DNA on any of the pieces of evidence. DNA from an unknown male was located on pieces of Cynthia's clothing that had been submitted for examination. The items were sent to another lab to confirm the findings of the crime lab. The second lab produced the same results. The DNA profile was run through criminal databases, but no match was found. Authorities then turned to genetic genealogy and worked with Marshall University to prepare a sample to submit to Parabon Nanolabs in Virginia. Parabon used this sample to attempt to identify a suspect based on the amount of DNA the sample had in common with individuals who had submitted their DNA to a genealogy database. They ultimately were able to identify a potential suspect in a report they generated during the summer of 2021. Authorities learned that the potential suspect had died in Texas in 1996, making it more difficult for them to confirm it was his DNA found on Cynthia's clothes. They then turned to the man's ex-wife and children. While they were upset by the idea that he was a murderer, they agreed to cooperate with the investigation, prioritizing Kirk and Cynthia's family's need for answers over their own discomfort. They provided samples of their DNA, which helped confirm that it was the suspect's DNA found on the evidence. They also provided additional information important to the investigation during interviews. They confirmed that the suspect had lived in the Klamath Falls area from 1976 until 1982, during which time he was employed at a local lumber mill. His family was very familiar with the area where Kirk and Cynthia's bodies were found, stating that they had gone camping with the suspect in that area regularly and had routinely driven through the area on the way to visit family friends as well. At a press conference on January 6, 2022, authorities announced that the suspect whose DNA had been found on Cynthia's clothing was Ray Mason Whitson Jr. He did not have a criminal record. According to Klamath County District Attorney Eve Costello, the DNA evidence was strong enough for Whitson to be prosecuted based off of it, had he not died before it was discovered. Detective Dan Towery met with Kirk and Cynthia's loved ones prior to the press conference. Both families requested that he publicly express their gratitude to Whitson's family for their willingness to cooperate with the investigation and bring them answers and some measure of closure, despite the emotional toll doing so took on them. While Whitson cannot be prosecuted or found guilty in a court of law, the investigation is formally being suspended, as prosecutors and investigators believe they have identified the only individual responsible for Kirk and Cynthia's murders. With the case formally closed, several personal items that belong to the victims that had been held as evidence for more than 4 decades can now be returned to their families. These items include postcards, jewelry, and an unmailed letter addressed to Cynthia's parents, written shortly before Cynthia was killed and found with her body. The letter described how much fun she and Kirk had in Washington state and detailed some of their hopes and plans for the future. The letter will finally be delivered to Cynthia's mother, more than 43 years after Cynthia wrote it. In 2007, 18-year-old Anita Knutson was a freshman at Minot State University in North Dakota, where she was studying elementary education. In addition to attending classes, she also worked at a local hotel and was making a variety of new friends in her new city. While she had left her family home in Butte, North Dakota, approximately an hour's drive from Minot, to attend school, she remained very close with her family and was in regular contact with them. According to Anita's younger sister Anna, Anita could make whoever she was speaking to feel as though they were the most important person in the world. Over the first weekend in June of 2007, Anna was at the North Dakota State Baseball Tournament with her father to watch her brother Daniel play. While at the tournament, Anna and her father realized that neither they nor Anita's mother had heard from Anita all weekend, which was strange. They had all tried calling Anita as usual, but they realized that she had returned no one's calls. Anita's family grew even more concerned when they learned she had not reported to work on Saturday, June 2nd, which was unheard of for Anita, who was responsible in all things, including her job. Anita's worried father, Gordon, therefore drove to Minot that Monday, June 4th, 2007, to check on his daughter at her apartment. He saw Anita's car parked outside, but she did not answer the door when he knocked on it. The door was locked, so Gordon walked around to his daughter's bedroom window. The window was open, and the screen was missing. Looking through the open window, Gordon could see Anita lying on her bed. He reached out to her through the window, but found that she was cold when he touched her. Gordon then rushed to find Anita's landlord, and he was ultimately able to convince her to open the door to the apartment using her copy of the key. When he finally got inside and to Anita, he confirmed that his daughter was dead. Anita had been stabbed twice in the chest. A pocket knife with dried blood on it was found in the apartment. Some reports state that the knife was found in a bathroom sink, but a later affidavit of probable cause states that it was found on Anita's bed. Anita's valuables, including cash, her laptop, digital camera, and cell phone, were all still in the apartment. Examination of her body found no signs of sexual assault. Anita's time of death was placed in the early morning hours of Sunday, June 3rd. Analysis of Anita's phone showed that she had been texting a friend just before 5 a.m. The friend sent Anita a text message at 4:43 a.m., and Anita responded to it at 4:48. The friend sent another text at 4:53. According to cell phone records, Anita never read that text message, and she made no further communications using the phone. This raised a lot of questions about Anita's whereabouts on Saturday, and why she had abruptly stopped speaking to her family and inexplicably skipped her shift at work. Investigators interviewed numerous individuals, some of whom knew Anita, and some of whom had connections to the area where she lived, but could not locate enough evidence to make an arrest in the case. Billboards were put up throughout the area asking for tips, but did not result in critical information being reported. Years passed, and the case went cold. Anita's death was devastating for her family. Her brother Daniel, in particular, struggled with Anita's death and was never the same after her murder. He took his own life in April of 2013, at the age of 22. What haunts me the most about the death of my sister is that whoever killed her also took the life of my brother that very day. After she was killed, he was never the same. I just don't think this person, or monster, knew the pain he would cause our family and friends. Anita's sister Anna would later tell Dateline. It would be nearly 15 years before a suspect was charged in Anita's case. On March 16, 2022, Minot Police Chief John Klug announced at a press conference that an arrest had been made in the case that afternoon. At 3:25 p.m., 34-year-old Nicole Rice had been taken into custody without incident at Minot Air Force Base, where she was employed in a civilian position. She was being charged with murder in connection to Anita's death. Chief Klug attributed the new momentum in the case to the television show Cold Justice, which had recently come to Minot to look into Anita's murder. The program follows former prosecutor Kelly Siegler as she brings investigators to police departments around the country to assist them with their investigations into cold cases. A lack of staffing and resources had prevented Anita's case from receiving the detailed attention Chief Klug felt it deserved in the previous few years. Chief Klug said at the press conference, "Although most of the detectives who worked the original scene and investigation have retired, we have not forgotten about this case. We tried to actively investigate Anita's case for the past few years, and finally, with the help of Cold Justice, we were able to move forward and regain focus. Due to the resources, logistics, planning, and experts they were able to provide, we were able to obtain an arrest warrant." Nicole Rice had gotten married in the years since Anita was murdered. In 2007, she was still using her maiden name of Thomas. She was also Anita's roommate. This had made her a person of interest from the early days of the investigation, but authorities did not have enough evidence to charge her. According to Chief Klug, only a few new details had come to light during the more recent investigation, and the arrest was made largely due to a detailed examination of the facts of the case and the information already available to investigators. Chief Klug did not disclose the evidence against Nicole Rice at the press conference, but some of it was detailed in the affidavit of probable cause filed on the day of her arrest. A major detail that had pointed to Nicole's involvement in the case from the very beginning was the fact that the door to the apartment she shared with Anita was locked when Anita's father discovered her body. The lock on the front door was a type that had to be both unlocked and locked with a key. There was no way for someone to lock the door without using a key. Anita, Nicole, their landlord, and a maintenance worker were the only people who had keys. Anita's key was still with her belongings inside, and the other 3 individuals were investigated. The screen to the window in Anita's bedroom had been slashed, and then removed from the window, which was left open. This allowed Anita's father to be able to reach inside the apartment and touch Anita's body when he came to check on her. However, while the screen may have been removed and the window left open, to make it appear as though someone had entered and left the apartment through the window rather than the door, evidence inside Anita's room showed that this was not the case. 2 fabric bins overflowing with items were located right below the window and had not been disturbed. There were no shoe prints or scuff marks near the window. Dust and cobwebs in the window were not disturbed, and the aluminum seam of the window showed no signs of it being bent under someone's weight. Nicole and Anita were roommates, but they did not get along. According to the affidavit, friends characterized Anita as kind, friendly, and likable, whereas they described Nicole as hot-tempered and reactionary. This led to tension between the roommates. Nicole told police after Anita was killed that she and Anita were best friends, and that she had never complained about Anita to anyone. Numerous witnesses contradicted these statements. Furthermore, a friend reported that shortly before the murder, they heard Nicole tell Anita, One way or another, I'm going to get you out of this house. Nicole was not home when Anita's body was found, and she told police that she had an alibi for the time of the murder. She claimed to have been at her family's farm since 7 p.m. on the night of Saturday, June 2nd. However, a witness reported being with Nicole in a bar in Russo on the evening of June 2nd into the early morning hours of June 3rd. As they were leaving the bar, Nicole told the witness that she was going back to her apartment in Minot to get some clothes. Following the murder, Nicole gave this witness several different stories and described Anita in derogatory terms using foul language. The same witness reported that Nicole told her details about the crime scene. These details should not have been known to Nicole. Nicole and her father have given accounts in which they both claim Nicole was at the farm from 7 p.m. on June 2nd onward. However, according to the affidavit, in their various statements to investigators, their various stories have changed and have been inconsistent and contradictory of each other, although the affidavit does not go into detail about these inconsistencies and contradictions. Investigators had long been aware of rumors that Nicole had admitted to the murder to someone, but they were not aware of who had heard the admission firsthand. In March of 2022, they identified that individual as William May. William had dated Nicole for several months in either 2008 or 2009. According to William, Nicole had attended a house party thrown by him and his roommates. Anita's murder came up, and some people began discussing theories about who the murderer could be. In response, Nicole became what William described as belligerently drunk. When they were going to bed, Nicole told William that she did it. He tried to get her to admit to the murder in more detail later when she was sober, but she would just become angry at the mention of the crime. Nicole Rice's first court appearance was made on March 17th, with Nicole appearing via video call from the Ward County Detention Center. The state argued that her bond should be set at $1 million, and her defense argued that such a high amount was not necessary because she was not a flight risk. The judge ultimately set her bond at $120,000 cash or $250,000 surety. She was able to post it by that evening. Nicole Rice is next due in court on April 21st for her preliminary hearing and arraignment. If convicted of the charges against her, she could be sentenced to life in prison without parole. In 1985, 63-year-old Helen Brooks lived in a 2-bedroom apartment at the Apple Valley Garden Apartments in Apple Valley, California, with her small dog. She had gotten a divorce from her husband Bill a few years earlier and was the mother of 2 adult daughters. Helen was a hard worker who had been employed at San Bernardino Valley College in the Food Services Department for 20 years. In 1985, she was working 2 jobs, one as a bookkeeper at the bowling alley across the street from her apartment complex, and another as a saleswoman at a fashion boutique called Lolo's inside the nearby Apple Valley Inn. According to the manager of the inn, Helen looked more like 40 rather than 63. This was in part because Helen lived such an active lifestyle and swam in her apartment complex's pool every night. Helen had a very sophisticated and stylish air about her that helped her in her job at Lolo's. She was regularly a model in the annual fashion show the boutique hosted. According to both her neighbors and her co-workers, she was very easy to get along with. She was very well-mannered and never raised her voice at anyone. She lived a quiet life, exercising and sewing in her spare time. On Friday, July 5th, 1985, Helen was scheduled to open Lolo's. She did not arrive at work, which was highly unusual. Her boss Dolores was also concerned because she had tried to call Helen all throughout the previous day, but never received an answer or a return call. She tried calling a friend of Helen's, and ultimately the sheriff's department was notified. When deputies arrived at Helen's apartment, they found her front door unlocked. Inside, they discovered Helen's body. No one who knew Helen could think of any possible motive for someone to want to kill her. Furthermore, Helen was a very cautious person, especially because she lived alone. She would always lock her door, even if she was just stepping away to speak to a neighbor for a moment. she also regularly reminded her neighbors of how important it was to keep their doors locked. Authorities did not immediately release Helen's cause of death, but 2 months later, they did disclose that she had been strangled with a nylon stocking. DNA evidence was recovered from Helen's body, but the exact nature of that evidence has not been disclosed. In the following years, numerous interviews were conducted and several polygraph examinations were administered in connection to Helen's case, but her killer remained unidentified. Cold case detectives looked into the case again in 2009 and submitted evidence for forensic examination in hopes that DNA would be found on it. The effort paid off, and a male DNA profile was identified. It was run through CODIS, the combined DNA index system, but no match was found. In 2021, cold case investigators with the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department's homicide detail partnered with the FBI's Riverside office and reopened the case. They requested additional analysis of the DNA evidence. Through what they described as additional investigation and advancements in DNA technology, they identified the individual whose DNA was left at Helen's crime scene. On January 24, 2022, almost 37 years after Helen was killed, it was announced that the suspect in Helen's murder was Robert Eugene Wortman. Wortman could not be prosecuted, however, because he had died in prison in 1995. At the time of his death, he was serving a 22-year sentence for a rape he committed in 1990. On Halloween of that year, he met a 49-year-old woman at a bar in Apple Valley. He drove her out to the landfill on Ukaloma Road, where he forced her to undress. He then raped her and forced her to perform oral copulation. He was convicted for this crime in 1991. Wortman was also convicted of rape in Sonoma County in 1978 and had a false imprisonment conviction in San Bernardino County. In August of 1985, just a month after Helen was murdered, he was arrested on suspicion of attempted rape in Victorville, California. Wortman was interviewed in connection to Helen's murder early on in the investigation. He had met her a few days before she was killed. He denied ever being to her apartment or having any part in her murder. While authorities were suspicious of him, at the time, they did not have access to the technology that would one day connect him to the crime. While the resolution of Helen's case did not lead to a conviction, it did provide an answer to the decades-old mystery. Friday, April 19th, 1991, was the start of a slightly longer weekend for 12-year-old David Hibbs. It was an early dismissal day at his school, so he got off the bus and arrived at his home in the 1200 block of Spencer Drive in the Croydon section of Bristol Township, Pennsylvania, around 1:05 p.m. David had gotten his report card that day and was excited to tell his mother that he had made the honor roll. However, when David arrived, smoke was pouring out of the windows of his house. He panicked, knowing his mother was inside because her car was parked in the driveway. He ran to the door to get inside to help her, but he could not make it past the flames and heavy smoke filling his family's kitchen. He then ran outside and began hysterically screaming for someone to help his mother. He got the attention of a neighbor who was outside doing yard work, and they called for help. Waiting for firefighters to arrive, the neighbor and a concrete worker who had been working nearby tried to get inside the home, but they could not make it past the smoke either. David told them that his mother might have been taking a nap in her bedroom, so they broke the window in that room, but when they looked inside, she was not in the room. Half a dozen neighbors came to help as well, using their garden hoses to try to contain the fire. Tragically, David's mother, 36-year-old Joy Hibbs, was inside the house. Her charred body was discovered in David's bedroom. Authorities initially assumed she had been killed in what they believed to be an accidental fire. However, it was determined that 3 fires, one in the hallway, one in the kitchen, and one in the bedroom where Joy had been found, had been set deliberately. The autopsy performed on Joy's body the day after her death showed that she had been murdered. There were no signs of smoke inhalation in her lungs, meaning she was dead before the fire started. She had been stabbed in the chest and neck 5 times, beaten badly enough that she had broken ribs, and strangled, most likely with the computer cord found wrapped around her body. The fire appeared to have been set to destroy evidence in the murder. Joy was originally from Central Florida and kept her southern charm even after she moved north. She loved to spend time outdoors fishing and gardening. She and her husband Charlie celebrated their 18th wedding anniversary 6 days before she was killed. The couple had 2 children, and Joy was a devoted and loving mother. Her daughter Angie, who was 16 years old at the time of the murder, would later describe her mother as her best friend. Joy worked as a medical assistant and was highly regarded by everyone in her community. Joy's husband Charlie was investigated for involvement in the case, but ultimately cleared of suspicion. He was at a job site in Northeast Philadelphia at the time of the murder. He voluntarily underwent a polygraph examination, which he passed, and did everything police asked of him. He was devastated by the loss of his wife. "I don't believe in God anymore," he told the Philadelphia Inquirer 2 months after the murder. "If there was a God, this wouldn't have happened. She never hurt anyone in her life. She had me on a diet and not smoking. Now, I'd die tomorrow, and I don't care. It doesn't bother me. I'm sick to my stomach all the time." Joy had no known enemies, and authorities had little physical evidence to go on, as most of the house had been charred by the fire and then covered in water during the efforts to extinguish it. Investigators therefore looked into Joy's movements on the day she was killed. 2 days a week, including Fridays, the doctor's office where Joy worked opened late and stayed open late. She would normally work from 8 a.m. until 2:30 p.m., but on Fridays she did not have to be at work until 2 p.m., so she had the morning free for her other responsibilities. After getting her children off to school, Joy had gone to the bank to cash her paycheck. Following her death, the contents of her purse were found strewn about her kitchen, and her wallet was found in her couch, with no cash in it, indicating that robbery may have been a potential motive for the crime. She left the bank at 9:53 a.m. She then went to the grocery store, with a receipt showing that she checked out at 10:54 a.m. Back at home, Joy was visited by a local minister and a member of his congregation. Joy had expressed interest in joining their church after attending services there on Easter. The 2 visitors were questioned and eliminated as suspects. They were witnessed leaving the home around 11:45. Police therefore placed the time of Joy's death as sometime between 11:50 a.m. and 12:50 p.m. During this hour-long window of time, multiple witnesses reported seeing one of the few major clues investigators had: a blue Chevrolet Monte Carlo seen parked haphazardly outside of Joy's house. The car had not only been notable because of how poorly it had been parked and the problems it created for drivers on the street, but also because the Hibbs home was at the center of a T-shaped intersection, making the front of their house an unsafe place to park. A potential suspect, who had a disagreement with Joy shortly before she was killed, did drive such a vehicle. Joy and her husband had started occasionally using marijuana in the late 1980s. Charlie usually obtained the small amount of marijuana they required from a coworker, but Joy had begun purchasing from a former neighbor, a man who drove a blue Monte Carlo. He had recently sold her what turned out to be just stems and seeds. Joy had tried to return it and get her money back, but he had refused. This individual refused to take a polygraph examination, later stating that his attorney had advised him against it because he suffered from carpal tunnel syndrome and nerve damage in his shoulder, which he said could interfere with the results of the test. Police also believed this individual had an alibi for the time of the murder, and that a disagreement over a transaction valued at somewhere between $20 and $40 was not a sufficient motive for murder. While he was considered a person of interest, there was not enough evidence to charge him with Joy's murder. Joy's family, however, was not convinced of his innocence. In 2014, Joy's son David stated that he believed police knew who the killer was, but had botched the investigation because they did not know what they were doing. In 2021, Charlie Hibbs, who is now 66 and living in Washington state, dipped into his retirement funds to offer a $25,000 reward in the case. The 3 decades that had passed since the murder had not eroded his desire to get justice for his wife. "This is something you can't put behind you. You just learn to live with it," he told the Philadelphia Inquirer. "I'm just reaching out for help. She was a good woman, and she never harmed anyone in her life. She didn't deserve what happened, and neither did my children." His son David, and a family friend who wished to remain anonymous, also contributed money, doubling the reward to $50,000. Just a year later, an arrest would finally be made in Joy's case. On May 25, 2022, Bucks County District Attorney Matthew Weintraub announced the arrest of 56-year-old Robert Francis Atkins of Fairless Hills, Pennsylvania. He was charged with murder of the first degree, murder of the second degree, 2 counts of arson, and 2 counts of robbery in connection to Joy's murder. Atkins was the person of interest who drove the blue Monte Carlo and had sold Joy marijuana. He had long been suspected by Joy's family. Following the announcement of the reward in May of 2021 and the media coverage it generated, Joy's case was reopened and eventually sent to a grand jury in January of 2022. One of the witnesses called to testify before the grand jury was April Atkins, the ex-wife of Robert Atkins. She had been contacted by police in connection to Joy's murder in 2014, but told them at the time that she did not know anything about it. Then, in September of 2016, following the deaths of her mother, niece, and significant other, she knew that there was something she needed to make right, and she went to the Bristol Township Police on her own accord. April told authorities that on the day Joy was murdered, her husband had come home with blood all over his clothes. He told her that he had stabbed someone and set their house on fire. He also ordered her to get their 2 young children ready because they were taking an unplanned weekend trip to the Poconos. He threw his clothes into the washing machine and took a shower. April did not want to leave town because she was due to go to work at 3 p.m. Her job required employees to give them at least 2 hours' notice for calling out for a shift if they wanted to use paid leave. Records from her employer confirmed that she had called out at 2:15 on April 19, 1991. The Atkins family had already lost their house 2 doors down from the Hibbs family home to foreclosure and was living paycheck to paycheck, so going without a day's pay was a major problem, but Atkins insisted that they go. They quickly packed and began driving to a motel in the Poconos. According to April, her husband drove incredibly fast and aggressively the entire drive. When she woke up during that night at the motel, her husband was not there. The next day, he had new sneakers. While they were staying at the motel, he had April dress the kids to take a walk, and they went out to an area behind the motel. Her husband had a bag with him when they started. He disappeared for a while and returned without the bag. The family stayed at the motel from late Friday afternoon until Sunday. Police went to the motel and confirmed that the family was there and accepted the timeline Atkins provided, placing their arrival in the early afternoon, making him appear to have an alibi for the time of Joy's murder, when in fact he did not. Records from the motel show that the family did not actually check in until 4:53 p.m. Atkins also claimed that the trip had been planned for weeks, a claim his then-wife's last-minute call to work to say she wasn't coming in that day seems to dispute. April stated that she had not come forward because she feared for her life. Robert Atkins had been physically and sexually abusive towards her since she was a teenager. He used drugs, including methamphetamines and steroids, which increased his violent behavior. However, his drug use also led to him becoming a criminal informant with police. He was very close with several officers. April had called police after some of the incidents of domestic violence during their marriage, but believed her husband's relationship with the responding department prevented action from being taken against him. While she and Robert were divorced by the time investigators came to see her in 2014, she was still afraid of him and had to be in regular contact with him because their youngest child, their son Gabriel, was still a minor. Gabriel was living with him at the time as well, potentially putting him in harm's way. April cooperated with police by making a recorded phone call to her ex-husband in December of 2021. Portions of this call were played for the grand jury. She told him a fabricated story about how authorities had arrived at her home to question her about Joy's murder, and that as she was making the call, they were interviewing her roommate, to whom April had admitted her ex-husband's involvement in the murder. He told her in a variety of ways to stop talking to police, and that the phone was probably being tapped. He also said that he had explained everything to their son Gabriel. Gabriel also testified before the grand jury. The possibility that his father was involved in a murder, and the recent attention his family was getting from law enforcement, had taken a major toll on Gabriel's emotional state. He tearfully admitted on the stand that while talking about the case with his father had stated that, "I might have done it," and "stuff happened." Joy's son David also testified before the grand jury. He stated that his mother had confided in him that she had gotten into an argument about marijuana with Atkins just weeks before she was killed. He testified that Atkins told his mother, "I will blow up your house, and I will kill you." After hearing testimony over a period of several months, the grand jury recommended that Atkins be charged on May 19, 2022. At his arraignment on May 25th, Atkins was denied bail, and he has been remanded to the Bucks County Correctional Facility. A preliminary hearing in the case is scheduled for June 8th. While Joy's family was not shocked by the identity of the man arrested for her murder, they were grateful he is finally being charged in the case. Following the arrest, they released a statement remembering Joy and thanking the members of the DA's office and the police department, whose recent work had led to Atkins being charged for the murder. The statement also read, "The immense grief and suffering our family has endured over the last 3 decades will never disappear. For 31 years, our family has been haunted by this tragic loss, knowing, without a doubt, that Robert Atkins was the perpetrator. Our family has waited 31 years for justice to prevail." The summer of 1992 was a difficult time for Nona Cobb. The 29-year-old was a widow and had lost custody of her 3-year-old son Josh 7 months earlier. Nona's sister Vicky and her husband had custody of the little boy. Nona loved her son very much and was very proud of him. She called her sister every day to check in on Josh. Nona was struggling with a drug problem. While her family did not support her drug use, they still loved her. She loved us and we loved her. Just because you do something wrong doesn't mean you stop loving her, her sister Vicky would later tell the Winston-Salem Journal. Nona was last seen alive on the night of July 6, 1992. She was seen getting into a truck with a man at the Welcome Center on Interstate 85 in Cleveland County, North Carolina, south of Kings Mountain. Her body would be discovered at 6:15 the following morning along the northbound side of Interstate 77 in Surry County, North Carolina. She had been strangled. There were few early leads in Nona's case. The first major suspect for her murder was identified in 1995. Sean Patrick Goebel was a truck driver from Asheboro, North Carolina, and was questioned about Nona's murder after a fingerprint tied him to another killing. He denied any involvement in Nona's case. Later that year, police were able to eliminate him as a suspect in Nona's murder based on DNA evidence collected from her body. Goebel was later convicted of killing 3 other women and is currently serving 2 life sentences plus 14 years in prison. Years later, it would be that same DNA evidence that would lead to investigators finally being able to make an arrest in Nona's case. In April of 2021, special agents from the State Bureau of Investigation's Cold Case Investigation Unit and investigators from the Surrey County Sheriff's Office began re-examining the physical evidence in the case. Still unable to find a match to the DNA from Nona's body, they began working with Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick, the founder of Identifiers International. This effort ultimately led to the identification of a suspect in the case. On March 15, 2022, almost 30 years after Nona was killed, 71-year-old Warren Luther Alexander was arrested in Diamond Head, Mississippi, and charged with her murder. He is currently being held at the Hancock County Jail, awaiting his extradition to North Carolina to face the charges. The investigation is ongoing, and authorities are not releasing any further information at this time. They are also investigating the possibility that Alexander is also responsible for other murders. Melissa Tremblay was born on March 1, 1977. Her father was not very involved in her life, and she was her mother's only child. According to her friends, Melissa had a fun and bubbly personality. She was a very tough little girl with a spunky attitude. She already had her own distinct personal style and preferred to have her hair feathered, and her clothes to have a funky edge to them. Melissa was featured in a local news story, looking for a big sister through the Big Brothers Big Sisters program at the Salem Boys and Girls Club, and stated that she wanted to be a secretary when she grew up because she liked to type. In 1988, Melissa and her mother lived in Salem, New Hampshire, and Melissa was a 6th grade student at the Lancaster School. September 11th of that year was a Sunday, and that day, 11-year-old Melissa traveled to Lawrence, Massachusetts, a 20-minute drive away from her home, with her mother and her mother's boyfriend. At some point, while the adults were socializing at the LaSalle Social Club on Andover Street, Melissa left the building to go play in the neighborhoods surrounding the club. Melissa was last seen in the late afternoon by a railroad worker and a pizza delivery man. Melissa's mother and her boyfriend frantically looked for Melissa throughout the neighborhoods around the social club, but could not find her. They called police to report Melissa missing at 9 p.m. Melissa would not be found until the following day, September 12, 1988. Her body was found in the old Boston and Maine railway yard near Andover Street and South Broadway, not far from the social club. She had been stabbed to death. After she was killed, her body had been run over by a train, amputating her left leg. Police interviewed numerous witnesses and identified multiple persons of interest over the years, but did not find enough evidence to arrest a suspect. Serial killer Tommy Lynn Sells, who rode rail lines and worked at carnivals, was considered as a potential suspect, but ultimately cleared of involvement in Melissa's murder. Melissa's mother passed away without ever learning who killed her daughter. Melissa's friend, Andrea Ganley, was just 7 years old at the time of Melissa's murder. Losing her friend in such a brutal way at such a young age played a major part in shaping the person she would grow up to be. As an adult, Andrea pressed for police to remain focused on the case and used social media to raise awareness about Melissa and her murder. According to authorities, the social media campaign was helpful, as it resulted in new tips being called in. Melissa's case was formally reopened in 2014 and investigated by assistant district attorneys and state police detectives assigned to the Essex District Attorney's Office Cold Case Unit. It would take several more years of work before an arrest was finally made in Melissa's case. On April 27, 2022, nearly 34 years after Melissa was killed, Essex District Attorney Jonathan Blodgett announced that the night before, 74-year-old Marvin C. McClendon Jr. of Bremen, Alabama, had been arrested as a fugitive from justice. He was considered a fugitive because of an arrest warrant that had been issued for him that day for Melissa's murder. McClendon was a retired corrections officer, previously employed by the Massachusetts Department of Corrections, working for the department on 3 different occasions between 1970 and 2002. At the time of Melissa's murder, he was living in Chelmsford, Massachusetts, but he had several ties to the city of Lawrence. At the time, he was moonlighting as a carpenter and worked at several locations in Lawrence. He furthermore was known to frequent several establishments there, including the Seventh-day Adventist Church on Salem Street. He also drove a van that matched the description of one witnesses had seen Melissa near on the day she was killed. At the time of the press conference, McClendon was in the custody of the Coleman County Sheriff's Office, pending his arraignment. A judge in Massachusetts had already ruled that he would be held without bond. McClendon ultimately waived rendition and was sent back to Massachusetts instead of first appearing in an Alabama court. McClendon first briefly appeared in court in Massachusetts on May 13th. He will next be in court on June 17th for a dangerousness hearing, when it will be determined if he should continue to be held in custody. According to D.A. Blodgett, McClendon had been a person of interest in the case for some time. He further stated that evidence found on Melissa's body was instrumental in identifying McClendon as her killer. However, due to the ongoing criminal case, he could not elaborate on the nature of that evidence at the time of McClendon's arrest. On the day of McClendon's first court appearance, prosecutors stated that DNA evidence had been found on Melissa's body when the case was reopened in 2014. Advanced DNA analysis eventually led them to McClendon's family. They took DNA samples from several members of the family, including Marvin. The rest of his family lives in Alabama, and he is the only known member of the family to have ever been in Massachusetts. He is also the only known member of his family who is left-handed, and analysis of Melissa's fatal wound showed that it had been inflicted by someone who was left-handed. Essex Victim Advocates has been in contact with the surviving members of Melissa's extended family. The family issued a statement on April 29th, which read, in part, "We would like to thank the police who have worked so hard over the years to make sure justice was found. Since her murder in 1988, we have always prayed for justice. We are very eager for the next steps that the Essex County DA's office will be taking in the prosecution of Marvin McClendon." In 1982, 15-year-old Karen Stitt was a recent transplant to the West Coast. She had recently moved to Palo Alto, California, from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, to live with her father and brother. She was a student at Palo Alto High School. One of her classmates there described her as a cool chick who always wore rock t-shirts and a big smile, although she generally remained rather shy in class. Karen developed a social life and learned how to navigate public transportation in California very quickly. She began dating a boy from the nearby town of Sunnyvale and would regularly travel by bus to see him. Karen rode the bus to Sunnyvale on the evening of September 2nd, 1982, to spend time with her boyfriend, David. Karen met David at a bus stop near the intersection of El Camino Real and Wolf Road in Sunnyvale, sometime between 8 and 9 p.m. The couple then went into a 7-Eleven convenience store by the bus stop to buy something to drink before heading on to Golfland, a nearby miniature golf course. They later walked to the grounds of a local elementary school. Around midnight, David and Karen began walking back to the intersection where they had met up earlier in the evening so that Karen could catch the bus back home. David opted not to walk her all the way back to the bus stop, however, as he was worried he would get in trouble with his parents for getting home later than they had instructed. He felt guilty for not walking Karen all the way back to the bus stop and waiting with her. He last saw Karen as she was just south of the intersection where the bus stop was located, just before she reached it. Just before 11 o'clock the following morning, a truck driver was making a delivery to the garden center near the bus stop where Karen would have needed to catch the bus. amongst the bushes at the base of a retaining wall that ran along the garden center's driveway, he noticed a nude young woman. He notified the staff at the garden center, who in turn called the police, who confirmed that the young woman was deceased. She was later identified as Karen Stitt. Karen's hands had been bound behind her back with her own shirt, and her jacket was found tied around her left ankle. Karen had been stabbed a total of 59 times in her throat, back, abdomen, and chest. 18 of the wounds had pierced her heart, and 10 of them had perforated her lungs. Karen had also been raped. Leaves and dirt around her feet had been disturbed, and markings in the dirt indicated that the ground may have been kicked, meaning that Karen may have still been alive when she was left at the location. Karen's killer had left numerous pieces of evidence at the scene, although it would be nearly 20 years before it could be properly analyzed. In 2000, evidence from Karen's case was sent to the Santa Clara County Crime Laboratory. Technicians there were able to develop a male DNA profile from both a blood stain left on the top of the cinder block retaining wall just above Karen's body when it was discovered, and from a cutting that had been taken from Karen's jacket, which had been tied to her ankle. The DNA profile from each of the samples was from the same individual. The crime lab was also able to identify a partial male YSTR DNA profile from sperm cells found on slides from vaginal swabs taken during Karen's autopsy. While this was not a complete profile, it was consistent with the DNA profile found on Karen's jacket and in the blood on the retaining wall. Unfortunately, there was no match to the DNA profile in any criminal database. David, Karen's boyfriend at the time of her death, provided a DNA sample, which was not a match to the DNA found at the crime scene, excluding him as a suspect. He had been considered a potential suspect from the early days of the investigation, because he was the last known person to see Karen alive, although Karen's family did not believe he was the killer. After meeting David, Karen's grandmother stated that the teenager lacked the strength and physical maturity needed to carry out such a violent crime. Despite this major development, without a match to the DNA profile, the case again went cold. In 2021, Sunnyvale detective Matthew Hutchison, who was born 2 years after Karen was murdered and had followed the case since he was a child, was the detective assigned to Karen's case. That year, he received a tip that one of the sons of a woman named Rose Aguilera Ramirez may have killed Karen. Detective Hutchison did not elaborate on the nature or source of this tip in the statement of facts he later used to obtain a warrant, although it has been reported that he had been working with genetic genealogists in recent years. Using public records, Detective Hutchison was able to locate a woman named Rose Aguilera Ramirez, who had lived in Fresno, California, 160 miles away from Sunnyvale, as early as 1950. She and her husband had 4 sons together, all of whom had been born in Fresno. Between 2021 and 2022, Detective Hutchison's work led to him being able to eliminate 2 of the brothers as Karen's killer. Another brother could not be conclusively eliminated, as, according to Detective Hutchison in the later statement of facts, based on the location of his residence, lack of publicly available information about his job and residence history at the time of the murder, and his current lifestyle, I could not do so without jeopardizing the integrity of the investigation. Detective Hutchison therefore focused in on the other remaining brother. He was able to locate a Facebook profile belonging to someone with the same name as one of the 2 grandchildren named in the obituaries of Rose Aguilera Ramirez and her husband. There were comments on public posts on the page from an individual with the same name as one of the brothers who had been investigated and then eliminated. In replies to these comments, the owner of the profile called this man Uncle Rudy and referred to the other excluded brother by his first name, indicating that he was not their father. Detective Hutchison obtained this individual's birth certificate, which listed a man with the same name and birth year as the brother he was currently investigating as their father. In April of 2022, Detective Hutchison obtained a DNA sample from the owner of the Facebook profile, whose name and gender have not been revealed so as to protect their privacy. Examination of the sample showed very strong statistical support for this individual being the biological child of Karen's killer. It further found that the DNA found at the crime scene was much less statistically likely to be from one of their uncles. Using this evidence as probable cause, Detective Hutchison applied for and was granted a search warrant to obtain a DNA sample from the father of the individual who had provided a sample of their own DNA. An investigator traveled out of state to collect the sample and quickly escorted it back to California for testing. Testing of the sample confirmed that this man's DNA was a match to the DNA found on and near Karen's body. On August 2nd, 2022, a month before the 40th anniversary of the murder of Karen Stitt, an arrest was finally made in the case. 75-year-old Gary Gene Ramirez was arrested at his residence, a guest house in Makawao on the island of Maui in Hawaii. When Detective Hutchison arrived at the home to arrest him, Ramirez was too shocked to say anything beyond, "Oh my gosh." Ramirez is being charged with murder, kidnapping, and rape. If convicted, he faces life in prison without the possibility of parole. Ramirez appeared at a hearing in the Second Circuit Court via video conference from Maui Community Correctional Center on August 10th. He waived his right to an extradition hearing, and according to the deputy prosecutor in Hawaii, authorities in California are working to have Ramirez return to their jurisdiction as quickly as possible. Gary Ramirez's brother, Rudy Ramirez, also lives on the island of Maui and was shocked at his brother's arrest. He has told police that they must have arrested the wrong man. "I've never seen him violent or get angry ever. He wouldn't hurt a fly," Rudy said after his brother's arrest. Gary, Rudy, and their two brothers grew up in what Rudy has described as a dysfunctional middle-class family in Fresno, where their father worked as a heavy equipment operator for the county. According to Rudy, Gary had been their parents' favorite son. Gary served in the United States Air Force in the early 1970s, and then lived in various locations throughout California and in Colorado. Rudy Ramirez had moved to Hawaii when he turned 18, and was not in contact with his younger brother at the time of Karen's murder. They were back in contact by the late 1980s, when Gary had been living in Fresno with their mother. Rudy convinced his brother to move to Hawaii with him, which Gary ultimately did. Gary married twice and had 2 children after arriving in Hawaii. He worked various jobs, often as a waiter or a bug exterminator, over the following years. By the time of his arrest, a hip injury had left him unable to work and reliant on disability payments. In his youth, he had been just shy of 6 feet tall, but by 2022, his health problems and age had caused him to lose about 5 inches in height. Karen's boyfriend at the time of her death, David, has been haunted by his decision to not stay with Karen while she waited for the bus for the past 4 decades. Her murder has left him exceptionally preoccupied with safety and with keeping his friends and family members safe. For 40 years, I have suffered heartache from the horrific loss of a beautiful girl whom I was falling in love with. I hope this brings some closure for her family, myself, and her other loved ones, he wrote in an email to the Mercury News after Ramirez's arrest. Karen's father and older sister both passed away prior to the arrest being made in her case. From her home in Florida, Karen's aunt has expressed her gratitude for authorities never giving up on Karen's case. On the morning of June 16, 1974, a man took his sons out into a swampy area of Singer Island on the eastern coast of Florida to look for driftwood. Instead, the family found the skeletal remains of a young woman amongst the mangroves. Wire had been used to tie her to a tree. The remains were entirely skeletonized, with scraps of clothing scattered around them. With only bones to go on, it was difficult for authorities to come up with a description of the young woman the remains belonged to. much less make an identification. They attempted to use dental records to identify her without success. They estimated that the young woman was between 13 and 19 years old, and that she had weighed between 83 and 133 pounds, and been somewhere between 4 feet 11 inches tall and 5 feet 2 inches tall. A cause of death could not be conclusively determined, and it was initially believed that she had died between 8 weeks and 8 months before her remains were located. Unable to identify the Jane Doe and notify her family, authorities had no choice but to bury her remains. The Jane Doe remained unidentified for decades, but investigators were eventually able to use new technology to attempt to determine who she was. Her remains were exhumed in April of 2014 in hopes of obtaining a sample of her DNA. Her DNA profile was successfully developed in 2015. There were no matches to it in any database, but investigators continued to find other uses for the profile. They were able to use the profile to exclude several missing women as potential matches. The Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office released a new facial reconstruction showing what their Jane Doe may have looked like while alive in 2019, but no one called in reporting that they recognized her. In December 2021, the remains were sent to Othram, a Texas-based laboratory, to develop a DNA profile so as to use genetic genealogy in the case. In March of 2022, genealogists presented the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office with several potential leads to follow up on. On June 2, 2022, the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office announced that the Singer Island Jane Doe had finally been identified. Her name was Susan Gale Poole. Susan was born on February 12, 1957. At the end of 1972, when she was 15 years old, she had dropped out of high school and was splitting her time living with her family in a trailer park near Fort Lauderdale and with a friend who had an apartment nearby. Susan's family reported her missing just before Christmas of 1972. When they first could not contact Susan, they weren't sure if she had left town on her own accord or if something had happened to her. She was known to hitchhike and had left once before. However, her clothing and belongings all remained at her friend's apartment, and Susan's sister Patty has stated that she knew something was wrong as soon as she saw Susan's purse left behind on the friend's couch. In 2022, nearly 50 years after Susan disappeared, her mother was still alive, and now in her 90s. She provided the DNA sample that confirmed that the remains found on Singer Island belonged to her daughter. Police believe that Susan may have been a victim of Gerard John Schaefer, a suspected serial killer and a former Martin County Sheriff's deputy. Prior to joining the sheriff's office, Schaefer had been a police officer with the Wilton Manors Police Department and had been fired for allegedly violating the Civil Service Code. He was accused of pulling over female motorists for traffic violations so he could get their basic information, and then using police resources to obtain further personal information about them, and contacting them to ask them out on dates. In July of 1972, 18-year-old Nancy Trotter and 17-year-old Paula Sue Wells were vacationing in Florida. While they were hitchhiking near the beach, they encountered a Martin County Sheriff's deputy, Gerard Schaefer. He told them that hitchhiking was illegal in the area, which was a lie. After radioing in to report that he would be transporting the two teenagers, he had them get into his vehicle and drove them to where they were staying in Stewart. He offered to give them a ride to Jensen Beach the following day because it was in his patrol area. The next day, he met them at the agreed-upon meeting spot in civilian clothes and driving his own car. Instead of driving Nancy and Sue to the beach, he drove them to an old shed on Hutchinson Island, where he handcuffed, bound, and gagged both of the young women. At this time, neither of them attempted to escape, as Schaefer threatened to kill the girl left behind if one of them tried to run. He further threatened to rape them, hold them for ransom, and sell them into slavery. Schaefer then tied Nancy and Sue to separate trees, not in view of each other, and put nooses around each of their necks. They had to balance on the exposed roots of the tree so as to not fall and be hanged. Schaefer believed this was enough to keep the young women secure and left them there. While he was gone, both girls were able to chew away at the ropes to give them enough slack to escape their nooses without injury. Nancy hid for half an hour, fearing Schaefer was still in the area. She eventually decided to run and fought her way through thick vegetation, fearing Schaefer would find her if she stayed on a path. When the trees became too thick for her to get through, she decided to swim in the nearby Indian River because she knew it would eventually take her to a road. Still handcuffed, she was able to swim using just her legs. When she finally made it to the road, she walked out of the water and began calling out to passing cars. The first car to stop was driven by Martin County Sheriff Robert Crowder. He had been out looking for Nancy because Sue had been found 45 minutes earlier and told authorities that her friend was in trouble. Sue had managed to get to a road after getting herself free, and a truck driver had stopped to help her. Sheriff Crowder was Schaefer's boss. After Schaefer realized the girls had escaped, he called the sheriff and told him, "I've done something foolish. You're going to be mad at me." Schaefer claimed that he had gotten carried away trying to teach the two young women a lesson about the dangers of hitchhiking. The sheriff did not believe him, and neither did the courts. Schaefer was arrested and charged with aggravated assault and false imprisonment. Schaefer was released on $15,000 bail. He was still free on September 27, 1972, the last day 17-year-old Susan Place and 16-year-old Georgia Jessup were seen alive. The two teenagers had become friends at Fort Lauderdale's Adult Education Center, where they were both students. Around 8:30 p.m. on the evening of the 27th, the two left Susan's home in Oakland Park, near Fort Lauderdale, with an older man to go play guitar at a nearby beach. Susan told her mother, Lucille, that her friend's name was Jerry Shepard. Lucille was suspicious of an older man spending time with two teenage girls, so she took note of his car, a blue-green Datsun, and wrote down his license plate number when he picked up the girls. The car was registered to Schaefer. Lucille would also later identify Schaefer as the man who the girls left with that day from a photographic lineup. George's father, who had met the man known as Jerry Shepard, also identified him as Schaefer. Susan and George's remains were found on April 1st, 1973. A father and son were out searching for discarded aluminum cans on Hutchinson Island when they came across the remains. Susan had been shot in the jaw, and according to detectives, evidence indicated that both girls had been tied to a tree and butchered. The location where they were found was only 6 miles away from where Schaefer had taken Nancy and Sue. While the two girls had gone missing at the end of September, investigators did not trace the license plate number provided by Lucille Place until the end of March, just a week before the remains were found. By this time, Schaefer was serving his 6-month sentence for the one charge of assault he pled guilty to over the attack on Nancy and Sue. He was questioned about the disappearance, but denied knowing Georgia or Susan. When their remains were located just a few days later, he became the prime suspect in their murders. Schaefer was indicted on May 18, 1973, and held without bond. He was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder that October. Schaefer was convicted during the period of time when the death penalty could not be imposed due to a Supreme Court ruling. The presiding judge later stated that he would have sentenced Schaefer to death had he been legally allowed to. Instead, Schaefer received 2 life sentences, with the possibility of parole in 2018, when he would have been 72. Schaefer maintained his innocence in the murders, claiming he was set up by one of his defense attorneys, who did go on to marry one of Schaefer's ex-wives. He was also critical of prosecutors using his creative writing as evidence in the case. They claimed that Schaefer's stories were thinly veiled accounts of actual crimes he committed. Schaefer claimed they were just art. However, after his high school girlfriend published a collection of these stories he had written, he did imply in a letter sent from prison that the stories were in fact confessions. Schaefer was found stabbed to death in his cell at the Florida State Prison on December 3, 1995. He had 43 stab wounds as well as defensive wounds on his hands and arms. His eyes had been stabbed badly enough to leave one of them completely destroyed, and he had 6 broken ribs. Prison officials identified his killer as Vincent Rivera, who was serving a life sentence for 2 murders he committed in February of 1990. Rivera's reported motive was his displeasure at Schaefer taking 2 cups of hot water from the water fountain rather than just 1 a few days before he was killed. Georgia Jessup's mother, Shirley, told reporters that she wanted to send Schaefer's killer a present, and that while she was always confident that her daughter's murderer would get what was coming to him, she wished it had happened sooner. While Schaefer was only ever convicted of 2 murders, he is considered a suspect in as many as 30 murders, some dating back to 1969. According to Circuit Judge C.P. Trowbridge, who presided over Schaefer's double murder trial, evidence ties him to crimes across the country. When police searched Schaefer's mother's home in Fort Lauderdale after Susan Place and Georgia Jessup's remains were found, they found items including jewelry, identification documents, a diary, and gold teeth belonging to at least 5 missing or murdered young women. The remains of other young women known to hitchhike in the area have also been found in similar circumstances as Schaefer's known victims. However, authorities never felt they had enough conclusive evidence to charge Schaefer with any more murders. Robert Stone, who prosecuted Schaefer for the murders of Susan Place and Georgia Jessup, described him as the most sexually deviant person I had ever seen. He made Ted Bundy look like a Boy Scout. Bill Haggerty, who interviewed Schaefer for the Violent Crime Apprehension Program during his tenure as an FBI agent, later stated that out of all the serial killers from across the country he interviewed during his time with the FBI, Schaefer was easily in the top 5 of the sickest individuals he talked with. According to Schaefer's statements to psychiatrists while he was incarcerated, he began associating pain and sex around the age of 12. He would tie himself to trees and would become sexually excited from hurting himself. Soon, that excitement was transferred to the idea of hurting women. His short-lived first marriage ended when his first wife filed for divorce, citing extreme cruelty. As with the numerous other potential victims of Schaefer, investigators have no concrete physical evidence connecting him to Susan Poole's murder. They believe he may be responsible for her murder purely based on circumstances. Susan was known to hitchhike, and Schaefer was known to pick up hitchhikers. Susan's remains were found tied to a tree, as were Schaefer's 2 known victims. Furthermore, while Schaefer was sentenced in the assault case involving Nancy Trotter and Sue Wells on December 22, 1972, the judge allowed him to delay the start of his sentence until after the holidays, meaning he was not in custody when Susan disappeared. The Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office is still searching for further evidence to see if Schaefer can be tied conclusively to Susan's murder. They are hoping that friends of Susan's from around the time of her murder may be able to help them connect Susan and Schaefer. In a Facebook post, they announced that they are hoping to locate and interview 3 of Susan's friends, Julie Hunt, Michelle Williamson, and Greg Anderson. They are asking that these 3 individuals contact Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office Detective Bill Springer. According to Detective Springer, Susan's mother and siblings were glad to know what became of her after so long, but he hopes to be able to give them further closure by being able to definitively identify her killer. 28-year-old Nancy Bennallack lived in an apartment at Arden Way and Bell Street in Sacramento and worked as a court reporter. Her fiancé, Faraz Salami, also worked in the criminal justice system as a public defender. He would later gain national attention for defending serial killer Richard Chase and would go on to become Sacramento's chief public defender. Nancy and Faraz spent the evening of October 25, 1970, going out to dinner together before returning to Nancy's apartment. The couple was to be married the following month. Ferris left Nancy's apartment around 11:30 p.m. to return to his own home. When he left, Nancy was in bed. The sliding glass door to her second-floor balcony was left slightly open, as she had a cat she allowed to come in and out as it pleased throughout the night. The following morning, October 26th, Nancy did not report to work, which was not typical behavior for her. One of her co-workers called her own son and asked him to go to Nancy's apartment to check on her. Her son found the apartment manager, who used his key to go into Nancy's apartment with him. Then they discovered Nancy's body in her bedroom. She had been stabbed almost 30 times, with such force that she had nearly been decapitated. Defensive wounds indicated that she had fought against her killer. Authorities were able to determine that the murderer had accessed the apartment by climbing up to Nancy's balcony and entering through the slightly ajar sliding door, and that he had wrapped tape around all of his fingers to prevent him from leaving fingerprints behind. Nancy's murder raised concerns that a serial killer may have been operating in the area, as one of Nancy's neighbors, another young woman with a successful career who was about to be married, had been killed just 7 months earlier. 23-year-old Judith Hikari was last seen leaving her shift as a nurse at Sutter Memorial Hospital on March 7, 1970. She had called her fiancé at 11:30 p.m. to tell him she was on her way home, but she never arrived. Her fiancé eventually went out to look for her and discovered her car parked in its assigned spot, but no sign of Judith herself. This led to concerns that she had been abducted as she walked from her car to her apartment, which was only a block away from where Nancy lived. Hikers found Judith's body weeks later in a shallow grave in Placer County. Unfortunately, even after decades passed and DNA technology advanced, DNA could not be used to either confirm or disprove a connection between the two cases. The evidence from Judith's case that potentially contained DNA from her killer was accidentally damaged and could not be tested. A source of DNA evidence was still available in Nancy's case, thankfully. Police had identified a blood trail that started on Nancy's balcony and continued onto the sidewalk below and around the buildings of the complex, before ending in the parking lot. Investigators believed that the killer had cut himself while attacking Nancy and left the trail of blood behind as he made his way to a car parked in the lot. A DNA profile was developed from the blood left behind in this trail. It was uploaded to the combined DNA index system, but no match was found. Years passed, and no profile matching that from Nancy's crime scene was ever uploaded to the database. Then, in 2019, investigators from the Sacramento County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Team and the Sacramento County District Attorney's Office began using forensic genetic genealogy in their investigations. The effort ultimately helped identify what they believed to be the killer's family. One member of this family seemed like a promising suspect, as he had lived in the same apartment complex as Nancy at the time of her murder. One of his relatives provided a sample of their DNA, which, based on the amount of DNA they shared with the profile from the crime scene, confirmed that the potential suspect was the person whose blood was left at the scene. On August 10, 2022, the Sacramento County Sheriff's Office announced that after more than 50 years, they had identified Nancy's killer as Richard John Davis. Davis had been 27 years old at the time of the murder. He had no known violent criminal history, although he had once been arrested for driving while intoxicated. Unfortunately, Davis could not be charged with Nancy's murder, as he had died in Sacramento County in November of 1997. It is believed that his death was the result of complications from alcoholism. Davis's apartment had been just across the complex's pool from Nancy's, and he most likely could have seen inside her apartment. While they cannot ask Davis about the motive for the crime, police believe he may have developed a fixation on Nancy after watching her in her apartment from his. Davis and his roommate, had been among the more than 500 people who were interviewed by police in the month following Nancy's murder, but they had provided alibis for each other. Nancy's fiancé at the time of her death, Ferris Salami, did not live to see her killer identified. He passed away due to leukemia in 2014 at the age of 84. Nancy's sister Linda had started to give up hope that Nancy's case would ever be solved. In a letter read at the press conference announcing Davis's identification, she expressed her gratitude for the work that went into solving the case, as well as her sadness over everything in her life she never got to share with her sister. In 1980, 22-year-old Dale Nancy Wyman lived on Washington Avenue in what was then the city of Vanier, Ontario. She had mentioned to some family members that she wanted to leave home because her father was abusive, but they did not expect her to leave without telling anyone where she was going, which she did on July 16, 1980. Around 11:45 that morning, she left home with a suitcase and hailed a cab to take her to a bus station on Catherine Street. She did not tell anyone where she was going, and her family never heard anything else from her. Police investigating her disappearance interviewed the main witness in the case, the taxi driver who picked up Dale and took her to the bus station. He told them that Dale had mentioned that she was not sure where she was traveling to, but she was considering Toronto or Montreal. He also said that when he went inside the bus terminal, after dropping Dale off to get a cup of coffee, he had seen Dale talking with two other young adults who have never been identified. Tips called into police placed Dale in Alberta in 1991 and Toronto in 1992, but the sightings were never substantiated. Dale's family received a phone call from a hospital in Saskatoon trying to locate the family of an individual in their care, but this did not lead them to Dale. This call did lead to retired RCMP officer Linda Davidson, who is now the director of an organization called Murdered Unidentified Cold Case Investigations, investigating hospital records and unidentified remains from this area, when she began working on the case as a private investigator decades later. In May of 2021, in honor of Dale's 63rd birthday, there was a new appeal to the public for information about the case. Police in Ottawa released a new age-progressed sketch of what Dale might look like, along with a video message recorded by Dale's sister, Brenda Larsh. In it, Brenda stated, "Dale is deeply missed by her brother and two sisters. Our hearts hold an empty space for her, and we pray and hope that someone may remember her in any way. Please help us to resolve this and find some peace and closure. Thank you, and God bless for any tips brought forward." Brenda also spoke directly to her sister in case she saw the message, saying that she loved her and wishing her a happy birthday. It would be this effort that would ultimately lead to the resolution of Dale's case. On August 10, 2022, Ottawa police announced that a third party had eventually seen the age-progressed image of Dale and called to report that Dale had been living outside of Canada and had recently passed away. Ottawa Police's Missing Persons Unit followed up on the tip and was able to confirm the information. At the time, authorities did not release any further information about what had become of Dale. However, it was later disclosed that the third party who had called in was Dale's daughter. Dale had made a life for herself in Ohio, where she had a family. She passed away just 2 months before her daughter saw the age-progressed image and learned that she was a missing person, whose family had never given up the search for her. Dale's siblings are struggling to accept this new information, as well as the fact that Dale passed away just before they found her. Dale's daughter has been put in contact with her family in Canada. In 1992, 53-year-old John Stagner was a hard-working employee of Orange County, Florida's maintenance department. He lived in a home on the county's maintenance property on North Forsyth Road. Around 5:30 a.m. on August 10, 1992, John's wife went to wake him up for the day. He was cold to the touch. She realized he had extensive injuries to his head and to his face, and was no longer alive. A person of interest was quickly identified in the case. John had a friend named Ronald Cates who had a drug problem and not enough money to support it or his family. John had recently allowed Cates to borrow some of his power tools. Unbeknownst to John, Cates had pawned the tools to get cash. Shortly before he was murdered, John had confronted Cates and told him that he had to finally return the tools. When police went to interview Cates, his daughter answered the door to the home, visibly shaking. Authorities would later learn that her father had ordered her to lie to the police and tell them that he wasn't home while he went to hide under the house. Cates could not avoid the police for long and spoke to them on August 11th and August 18th. There were inconsistencies in his statements and with the timelines provided by his family members. Still, police did not have direct evidence tying him to the crime. During a suicidal incident in 1995, Cates reportedly confessed to killing John in front of his family. His family members reported the confession to police, but given the circumstances of the confession and the continuing lack of corroborating evidence, Cates was not charged with the murder. Decades would pass before investigators had enough evidence to file charges in John's case. On August 10, 2022, 30 years to the day after John's murder, Orange County Sheriff John Mina announced that Ronald Cates had been charged with John's murder and was being held in a North Carolina jail pending extradition back to Florida. Cates' arrest was finally made based on his own actions and the efforts of his own family, who had come to police in 2020 to make sure John's case was still being actively investigated. They all wanted justice for John, even if it meant confirming their husband or father's involvement in the crime. John had always been kind to them, providing them with money and shelter when they were struggling. The family members had been limited in how forthcoming they could be at the time of John's murder, because Cates was very abusive, and they lived in fear of him. The more casual check-ins with police about the case and its progress turned into more extensive interviews in March of 2022. During these interviews, the family members were able to provide very detailed timelines of the hours around the time of John's murder, which showed that Cates did have time to go to John's house and commit the murder. They also mentioned that Cates liked to walk with a walking stick, a detail which stuck out to investigators. A large stick had been found at the crime scene. Investigators were able to provide a photograph of the stick to Cates' family, and they confirmed that it looked like the walking stick Cates had been using around the time of the murder. The final piece of evidence came in April of 2022, when Cates again confessed to the murder. This time, however, he confessed multiple times, and his confession was eventually captured on video. Cates was having a mental evaluation in a North Carolina hospital when he allegedly told a nurse that he had killed a man in Florida in 1992. The nurse went to get a security guard, and Cates made the same confession to the guard. The nurse and the guard used the internet to do research to see if the claim could be true, and found John Stagner's case on the Orange County Sheriff's website. They then notified local authorities about the confession. Officers from the Salisbury Police Department responded to the hospital, and Cates gave them a 10 to 12 minute long confession, which was captured on the officers' body cameras. Cates did not provide a motive for the murder. He did explain that, in his words, he had hit Johnny with a stick. Authorities in Florida re-interviewed Cates and believed they now had sufficient evidence to charge him with first-degree murder, which led to Cates being arrested on August 5th. John's murder is the 13th case solved by the Orange County Sheriff's Office's Cold Case Unit since the unit was established in 2020. In May of 1990, 35-year-old Myrtle Brown needed some time away, so she traveled to New York City to visit her best friend. However, the trip proved to be anything but relaxing. While in the city, someone stole her purse, which held all of her money, her identification, and medication she used to treat her epilepsy. Myrtle called her mother back home to tell her about the robbery. She also mentioned that she was not feeling well and that she would have to find a hospital where she could obtain an emergency refill on her prescription. Myrtle's family never heard from her again. They reported her missing and went to New York, where they spent weeks visiting hospitals and police stations looking for her with no success. They had to return home without answers, and decades would pass with no information about what became of Myrtle. Myrtle's daughter Ebony, who was just 13 years old when her mother went missing, struggled with going through the milestones in her life without her mother, especially because she did not know for sure if her mother was absent from her life voluntarily or not. Myrtle's family would not receive any new information about her case for more than 30 years. In April of 2022, the month before the 32nd anniversary of Myrtle's disappearance, Myrtle's brother Robert was watching NBC's Nightly News with Lester Holt. The show aired a segment about a cold case squad working out of the New York City Office of the Chief Medical Examiner to determine the identities of more than 1,200 unidentified sets of remains located in New York City over the course of the past several decades. During the segment, Robert saw one facial reconstruction that he believed looked like his sister. He decided to contact the unit to see if they could help him determine if the woman depicted in the reconstruction could be Myrtle. Dr. Angela Soler, the assistant director of forensic anthropology, and her team began looking into Myrtle's case. The woman in the reconstruction that initially inspired Robert to call was proven not to be Myrtle, but Dr. Soler and her team continued researching to see if Myrtle was in fact one of the unidentified individuals in their caseload. Using Myrtle's physical details and the timing of her disappearance, the team was able to identify a potential match after more than 2 months of work. Dr. Soler notified Robert and Ebony about the potential match over a phone call. To see if they were correct, the team had to send them a photograph of an unidentified individual taken after they had passed away. When Ebony and Robert saw the photograph, they were able to confirm that the woman was Myrtle. 32 years after Myrtle went missing, her family finally learned the details of what had happened to her. Myrtle had suffered a seizure while waiting in the emergency room at Kings County Hospital and passed away. However, she died during a brief period of bureaucratic limbo that prevented her from being quickly identified and her family from being notified of her death. She had not yet registered with or been admitted to the hospital, so when her family searched for her, there was not a record of her being a patient there. Since her purse had been stolen, she had no identification with her when she died. Internal records do show that she did provide her name and date of birth to the hospital when she arrived to the emergency room, which helped the cold case unit identify her more than 30 years later. The Brown family was able to hold a virtual memorial for Myrtle after she was identified. They say that they now have peace, knowing what happened to Myrtle. Between March of 1990 and February of 1991, the St. Louis area saw a string of murders attributed to a murderer who came to be known as the Package Killer. This moniker stemmed from the fact that the victims were all found in public areas in large, visible containers. 2 victims were found in garbage cans, 1 in a wooden box, and 1 in between 2 mattresses. All of the murders had connections to an area of South St. Louis known for sex work at the time. The victims were Robin Myhan, 18, Donna Reitmeyer, 40, Brenda Pruitt, 27, and Sandy Little, 21. Robin, Brenda, and Sandy all had young children when they were killed. Sandy's body was the last to be discovered in February of 1991. At that time, the St. Louis Major Case Squad made an arrangement with the FBI. They agreed that the next time the body of a suspected victim of the Package Killer was found, they would seal off the crime scene and wait for the FBI to arrive and process the evidence. However, there were no more victims, and therefore no new pieces of evidence in the case, which then went cold for more than 3 decades. Sandy Little's body had been discovered in O'Fallon, Missouri, giving police there the authority to investigate the case. O'Fallon Police Detective Jody Weber reopened the case in 2008 and worked on it for 14 years before it was finally solved. Technology did not advance to the point where DNA evidence could be identified on any of the evidence in the case until 2022. Even then, some of the DNA evidence had been compromised, and Sandy Little's now adult son, Chris Day Jr., had to provide a sample of his DNA to confirm that his mother's DNA was on the same item as the DNA of her alleged killer. Police reportedly have 4 pieces of physical evidence tied to both the alleged killer and to 3 of the victims through DNA. Once the DNA profile of the killer was developed, finding out who it belonged to proved to be very simple. A match was found during a search of the FBI's combined DNA index system because the alleged killer was incarcerated. On September 19, 2022, prosecutors announced that the package killer had been identified as 73-year-old Gary Muehlberg, an inmate at the Potosi Correctional Center in southeastern Missouri, who was serving life without the possibility of parole for the 1993 murder of a man named Kenneth Atchison. Kenneth was an acquaintance of Muehlberg's who wanted to buy a car from him. Muehlberg killed him, took the money he was going to pay for the car, and hid his body in a makeshift coffin in his basement. The DNA evidence connected Muehlberg to the murders of Robin, Sandy, and Brenda. Detective Weber went to the prison to confront him with this evidence in the summer of 2022. Once prosecutors agreed that he would not face the death penalty, Muehlberg began cooperating with them. He confessed to murdering Robin, Sandy, and Brenda. He also admitted to killing Donna, whose murder was suspected to have been committed by the package killer, but never definitively tied to the other murders until this confession. In addition, Muehlberg claimed that he killed a 5th woman, whose name he does not remember. He says that after he killed her, he put her body in a metal barrel, which he left at a self-service car wash. Authorities are working to try to identify this woman and determine what became of her body. Muehlberg is currently facing 4 charges of first-degree murder in the cases of Brenda, Donna, Sandy, and Robin. In a phone interview after his confession, Muehlberg stated that he did not know why he started or stopped his killing spree, as he had paid many other women for sex, but had not killed them. He tried to claim that he confessed to try to do something positive for the victims' families, an assertion that is not supported by the fact that he did not choose to admit to his crimes until he was confronted with physical evidence tying him to them, and he knew he would be facing charges. He also wants to quickly confess to and be sentenced for his crimes in court, claiming he wants to spare the victims' families the stress of a trial. However, those who know him say he is most likely more concerned with losing his cell on the honor block in the correctional facility if he is away facing trial for too long. None of the relatives of Muehlberg's victims, who have spoken publicly since Muehlberg's identification, believe he thinks about anyone but himself. Paul McGinty was from Montcharles in County Donegal, Ireland. He was one of 9 children. Like many Irish men, he moved to England for work in the 1960s. He lived for a time in London before moving to Coventry and supporting himself by working on building sites. Paul, then aged 51, was going through a difficult time in 1991 as he was out of work. He was able to pay the rent he owed before he suddenly went missing on April 8th, leaving all of his belongings behind. Paul's friends had tried to get local authorities to investigate his disappearance, but police did not take an interest in the case. While he no longer lived near them, Paul had still been in contact with his family back in Ireland. His sister Eileen saw him in person for the last time in 1987 when he came home to attend their brother's funeral. They would call each other for Christmas and Easter, and a few times in between each year. When she called the home where he had been staying one day in 1991, his landlord informed her that Paul had gone missing. Eileen would be the only one of Paul's siblings to live long enough to see his disappearance solved more than 30 years later. On April 18, 1991, a man's body was found in Bracetown, County Meath. Foul play was not suspected in his death, but the man had no identification on him, and since his identity was unknown, his next of kin could not be notified of his death. The man had been seen around the county in the week previous, talking with locals at a pub and attending a Gaelic Athletic Association match, but no one who had seen or interacted with him knew his name. He had looked disheveled and had been living as a transient once he arrived in the area. The man's body was photographed, as were his belongings, including the gray herringbone coat he had been found wearing and the St. Christopher medal he carried with him. 7 months of investigation did not uncover the man's identity. He was then buried in a grave marked only by a small stone in St. Mary's Cemetery in Navan. A renewed effort to learn the unidentified man's identity began in 2021. His remains were exhumed in hopes of collecting a DNA sample, but things did not go according to plan. Forensic Science Ireland ultimately concluded that a usable DNA sample could not be collected, which can sometimes happen based on circumstances during the exhumation, or the extent or nature of how the bones had degraded. Investigators then turned to the other evidence they had in an effort to solve the case. The man's body had been discovered within a day or two of his death, meaning it had not yet decomposed very much, so the photographs investigators took of his body at the time it was found gave a good idea of what the man had looked like in life. Because the photographs were such high quality, they were sent to a forensic artist who drew an image of what the man would have looked like before his death. This image was subsequently shown on the RTE television program Crime Call in hopes that someone would recognize him. A man named Michael Leonard happened to be watching the program the night it aired in his home in County Donegal. He nearly fell out of his chair when he saw the artist's rendering on the screen, as he immediately recognized it as Paul McGinty. Michael had met Paul decades earlier when Paul and Michael's brother John worked together in Coventry. John had seen Paul just the day before he disappeared. Other members of the Leonard family had met Paul as well, and they had all never forgotten him, wondering what had become of him in the decades after he disappeared. When Michael told the other members of his family about the composite image, they all also recognized it as Paul upon seeing it. Michael then went to see Paul's sister Eileen to show her the image, and she too immediately recognized it as her brother. She went to the authorities to begin the process of confirming the identification. In November of 2022, a coroner's inquest was held in Mead Coroner's Court, outlining the details of the case and formally identifying the previously unidentified man found in April of 1991 as Paul McGinty. It is unknown what brought Paul to County Mead, as he had no known ties there. His lone surviving sibling, his sister Eileen, who is now in her 80s, was able to attend the inquest and see her brother's case officially solved after more than 3 decades.